In this film, I'm going to be talking about the exposure triangle. It's a basic fundamental principle of exposure, and a good understanding and use of it will help you to get better exposures and more consistent ones too. Now, the exposure triangle is made up of three things: the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. When light comes into the camera, it first of all enters through the aperture, then it goes through the shutter, and finally it hits the sensor. The sensor is the equivalent of film and gathers light and makes the actual picture. I'll be talking about each of those three different things, but first of all, let's look at apertures. I tend to think of apertures as being like the pupils of our eyes. They open up to allow more light in, and they close down to reduce the amount of light. We're fantastic, us humans, aren't we? Our eyes do it automatically, but with a camera you have to give it a helping hand. So the aperture controls the amount or the quantity of light coming into the camera, and the aperture is always open to 1 degree or another. When the aperture is opened up, then more light is let through, and obviously when the aperture is closed down, less light is let through. The next thing on the exposure triangle is the shutter speed. Now, unlike apertures, which are open all of the time, the shutter opens and closes, a little bit like shutters on a window. And the shutter opens and closes at different speeds, so it controls the duration of the light. Generally speaking, in most photos that you'll take, the shutter opens for just a fraction of a second to reduce the duration of light going through it, like this. But it can also remain open for several seconds, like this, to increase the amount of light going through it. So, now let's take a look at the way the aperture and the shutter speed work together as a team to balance out the light and to create a photo that is properly exposed. That is, it's not too light and it's not too dark. Let's say we were using a wide aperture so that lots of light was coming into the camera. To balance that out, we would need to use the faster shutter speed to reduce the duration of the light coming in. Otherwise, the picture will be too bright. Here's an example then of a wide aperture and fast shutter speed in action. Watch carefully, blink and you'll miss it. In case you missed it, let's do that again. Now let's do the exact opposite. Let's say we have a small aperture. So now less light is going to be coming through the lens, and so to balance that out and to make up for the smaller quantity of light, we would need a slower shutter speed, which will therefore increase the duration of the light. We can easily achieve this balancing act between apertures and shutter speeds by using the automatic modes built right into your camera. Now, SLR cameras and the new mirrorless cameras and some of the more sophisticated compact cameras have a mode dial on top of the camera. But because compact cameras are so small, they don't have room for this mode dial, so you can usually change the settings via the menus. It's easily done. The first mode we're going to look at is something called Aperture Priority. Canon refer to it as the AV mode, Aperture Value. Nikon and other cameras, on the other hand, refer to this mode as the A mode. The way it works is you set the aperture value, whether it's a large or small aperture, and the camera automatically figures out the corresponding correct shutter speed to give you a properly exposed photo. Now, the exact opposite is another mode called Shutter Priority. Canon call this mode TV, which stands for time value. Nikon and other cameras call it the S mode for Shutter Priority. In this mode, you select the shutter speed that you want, and the camera figures out how large or small the lens aperture should be to give you a properly exposed photo. So we've talked about shutter speeds and apertures and how they balance out to give you a good exposure. But what about ISO? How does that work? What does that do? Well, ISO controls the sensitivity of the camera. As an analogy, imagine if you went to the cinema and you got there a little bit late and all the lights were turned down as you walked in. It would be almost pitch black, you'd hardly be able to see a thing. But then after a short while, your eyes adjust to the dark theatre and you can start seeing the rows of seats and other people. And then afterwards, when you leave the cinema, everything looks a little bit too bright, doesn't it? Especially if the sun is shining. But your eyes soon adjust. So the camera sensor is a little bit like our eyes in that it can be less or more sensitive to light. Higher ISO numbers like 3200 and 6400 make the sensor very sensitive to light, allowing you to take photos in low light without a flash, just like our eyes in a dark cinema. Lower ISO numbers like 100 and 200 make the sensor less sensitive to light, which is much better for taking photos outside. So we have three factors that work together to control the exposure: aperture, shutter speed and ISO, and they're all important in their own way. So where do you start? Which one should you give priority to? Well, as well as making the sensor more or less sensitive to light, ISO also has a big impact on image quality, especially in regard to noise or grain, as it used to be called. There's a whole film dedicated to ISO elsewhere on the site, and I recommend you take a look at that. So when it comes to aperture priority or shutter speed priority, which one of those should you choose? Well, that depends very much on the type of picture you want to take, and this is where you start to get creative. If you want to control the depth of field, to control the amount of the image that's in focus from front to back, to maybe blur the background for a portrait, or maybe you want to take a landscape photo where everything is in focus, then you should choose aperture priority. There's specific films about lens apertures and depth of field, so I recommend you take a look at those. If you want to control movement, say for sports, or maybe a toddler who won't stand still for a moment, then you can use shutter speed priority to set a fast shutter speed, which will then freeze the action. You can also set maybe a slow shutter speed to exaggerate movement, or to maybe take a panning photo of a subject moving across the frame. There's a couple of films coming along on shutter speeds and also on panning, so keep an eye out for those. So to sum up then, the camera does most of the work for you in its various auto modes, but it's still very worth knowing about the exposure triangle. It will stand you in good stead for the future. Bye for now.